The act of moving onward means we pass these signposts. One of them was first leaving Earth. The next one is hanging out on the moon. What's next? The planets. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together. This fragile little world. This fragile little world. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together. This fragile little world.
Hello folks, and welcome to another episode of Voices from L5. Today we have James Howe, an expert in planetary defense. He's on here to talk to us a little bit about, well, what planetary defense is and, what that field entails. Hi, James.
How are you?
Doing great, thanks. It was a little bit of a rocky start to this episode, but it's glad to finally get you on.
Got the IT working. That's a good thing.
Yeah. So let's kick off right away and just, what is planetary defense? I know when I say that, some people have various different ideas about what that subject is. One person I talked to this week when I brought it up was wondering if this was sort of an Independence Day style thing where we were making plans on how to defend the planet from alien invaders. So what's the general gist of this field?
Yeah, hopefully it's not that sort of thing. The bottom line is that there's many asteroids and comets in our solar system, and some of them, unfortunately, cross paths with Earth. And the whole idea of planetary defense is to identify any potentially hazardous object out there that's headed our way, and to characterize it, to try to find out what it's made of, and then to find a way to deflect it or move it off its path so it doesn't hit our planet. Now, if you go back only 30 or 40 years, no one even knew that this threat existed. If you look at places like the Meteor Crater, the Barringer Crater out in Arizona, that huge, almost mile-wide crater sitting in the middle of the desert, people actually thought after it was discovered that that was a volcanic type of activity that had caused that. And it wasn't until about 40 years ago people started to realize that these were actually impacts from celestial bodies that were entering our atmosphere and hitting Earth. The whole idea that the dinosaurs might have gone extinct because of a large asteroid impact, that's 1980s era science. The Alvarez father and son scientists that discovered the Chicxulub crater down in the Yucatan Peninsula, that was happening in the early 80s. So this is relatively fresh science. And what has led us to realize is that there's a huge population of asteroids and comets that aren't really playing nice with us. I mean, most of them, of the 1 billion roughly asteroids and the up to potentially 2 trillion comets in our solar system, are in nice, stable orbits way far away from Earth. Most of the asteroids, of course, are out between Mars and Jupiter in the asteroid belt. Most of the comets are out way far away in the Kuiper belt, out past Neptune, or even further out in the Oort cloud, which kind of circles the whole solar system, millions and millions of miles from the sun. But every now and then, one of these guys goes rogue and kind of breaks a normal orbit. It could be through a gravitational perturbation because they get too close to Jupiter or something like that. Could be because a couple of asteroids collide with each other and one of them goes askew. And so there are literally millions of asteroids and comets that will pass within relatively close celestial distance of the Earth. And what NASA has done is come up with some terminology here. So they characterize anything that passes roughly within 1.3 astronomical units of the sun as what's called a near-Earth object. So that would come within about 50 million kilometers of our planet. That's not real close. And then they've taken that population, which is about 1% of all asteroids, and they've looked at a subset, a much smaller subset, less than 10%, which they call potentially hazardous objects. And those are ones that are going to pass at some point within about 7.5 million kilometers. And those are ones to actually have to start worrying about, because over time, as they go through their 4 or 5 or 6 year cycle of orbit around the sun, they might gradually, have their orbit changed, or they might eventually 10 or 20 or 30 orbits out intersect with Earth's orbit, which is a bad day for everybody. So the whole science of planetary defense is to identify these potentially hazardous objects, figure out which ones, if any, are going to be hazardous to us, and then do something about it.
Yeah, this is one of those fields that I think gets that sort of pop sci attention every now and then whenever there's a new study or a new project to identify these asteroids. You often see large, scary headlines. Like recently there was that asteroid that swung around Earth a couple years ago and is due on its way back again. And there were some pretty provocative headlines stating ridiculous things like there's a 30% chance of us being completely wiped out in 2008 and things like that. So I think that some of the public might have a certain interesting view of these asteroids coming to get us. The most interesting part of what you just said, I think, to me at least, was that this is so recent. Even I thought that this was something that we had sort of established a long time ago, that asteroids were a danger to us. With all that said, how exactly do you guys look for these dangerous objects? Is it through the spectrometry that people prospect those asteroids for sometimes, that you hear about with like planetary resources and stuff, or are there other techniques for determining these things?
Right. The best way is a space-based infrared telescope. There's actually two of those currently in operation. One called the NEOWISE spacecraft, which orbits Earth. It's a NASA satellite. And then there's a smaller Canadian satellite. The ideal would be to put a infrared satellite in a sun orbit around the sun closer to the sun than Earth is, so it could kind of look out and protect us also, and to detect the asteroids that might be actually flying within Earth's orbit that we're not even aware of because they're between us and the sun. And those are probably the most dangerous ones. So what's happened over the years is, I mean, the first near-Earth asteroid wasn't even discovered till 1898, and that was Ceres, which is, as you know, a very, very large asteroid. And for about the first 70 years, they only found 100 of these things. Well, since the 1970s, we found about 14,000 more.
Wow.
And so that's quite a population. And we do it mostly right now through ground-based, terrestrial telescopes. They look out and they can take a picture of the night sky in a certain quadrant, and then they take another picture a few minutes later. They just compare and see what moves. And if anything moves, of course, it's either a satellite or it's an asteroid or it's a comet or something like that. So the big ones have been the Pan-STARRS telescope out in Hawaii. Right now, they're finding about half of all the near-Earth objects. Back in January of this year, they set a record. They found 19 near-Earth objects in one night. That's no telescope has ever done that before.
Wow.
And we're finding about 12 to 1,300 a year, which is good, because if you just go back again a couple of decades, we're finding maybe one or two a year. So we've, by a couple of orders of magnitude, increased that. But that said, that's not enough if we want to be serious about that. We're looking at a total population literally of probably at least 1 million asteroids out there that will come close enough to Earth to be of some concern. And we found, probably 1 or 2% of them at the most. Now, the real good news is that the nature has been nice to us here. The really big civilization-killing asteroids, the ones that are a kilometer or larger, they're very infrequent. We think there's only about 1,000 of those in the solar system that are even near-Earth objects that are going to come within 50 million kilometers of our planet. And we think 90 to 95% of those, and that's a really good thing. So the ones that you see in the Bruce Willis movies, we've found almost all of those, and none of them pose a threat right now, at least for centuries and centuries and centuries, and that's a good thing. But when you get into the middle sizes, the 300 meter, the 100 meter, the 150 meters, these are asteroids that can do very significant damage to the planet. And we have only found a small proportion of them. In fact, the 30 to 100 meter asteroids, which could do pretty serious damage if they exploded or landed near a populated area, we found 0.5% of those, of a population of roughly estimated 500,000. So those are the ones we're kind of most worried about. We found most of the big ones, but these smaller ones that can do still a lot of damage, the vast majority of them remain undiscovered, and that's what we need to be looking for now.
It's always amazing to me how lucky we've been that those impacts and those explosions have been so far fairly far away from populated areas. There was a news thing a couple years ago about one that exploded over Russia, and I think something like 100 people were injured, but no one was too seriously injured, I don't think. And considering how, I guess it's only really in the last 100 years we've had these massive cities that have existed, so fairly small chunk of time, but still pretty impressive stuff that we haven't had one of our cities wiped off the map just yet.
Yeah, and if I could just add a little bit about that, that was on February 15th, 2013. It was over a city called Chelyabinsk in Russia, and just a couple of really interesting things. That very same day, we were tracking. The science community was tracking an asteroid called DA 2012 DA 14. It's about a 40-meter wide asteroid, and it was going to pass between Earth and the geosynchronous satellites that rotate or orbit around Earth. So within 40,000 kilometers, that's pretty close. So the science community was really paying a lot of attention to that one real near miss that was happening that very same day. And out of nowhere, this Chelyabinsk asteroid, came out of nowhere. It was about probably 17 or 18 meters long, exploded over the city at a height of 30 kilometers. So it was way up there. And it blew up at a total explosive force of about 450 to 500 kilotons, which is about 20 times the amount of explosive force as the bomb that we dropped on Hiroshima.
Good Lord.
So it's incredible. It injured over 1,000 people. It blew out 1 million linear feet of windows. And thank God no one got hurt. Now, the other really weird thing here is that Chelyabinsk is an old Russian nuclear site. They do a lot of research and they build nuclear weapons, or they used to build nuclear weapons there. So one of the first reactions that was seen in the press, the intel community reported on, was that one of the Russian generals thought it was the U.S. attacking them when that asteroid went off. And I think one of the reasons why we really ought to be concerned, even though the likelihood of an asteroid landing on a city or landing near a populated area is very remote in a human lifetime, it's less than a couple of percent. We're in a hair trigger world right now. We've got a lot of kind of crazy people like the regime in North Korea with nuclear weapons. We've got Pakistan and India with nuclear weapons. Lord knows who else is developing them right now. And if someone were to mistake a natural occurring event, which has all the manifestations of a nuclear attack with a nuclear attack, we could have real problems on our hands. So I think the world at this point needs to really pay attention to this to make sure that some 20-meter rock that comes flying out of space doesn't trigger something much, much worse when people mistake it for an actual military attack.
My first thought there is if that had happened 20 or 30 years ago during the Cold War, I don't even think we'd be having this conversation at this point.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And that's what I think we should all worry about, because again, going over the numbers as to what are the chances when you're talking the 1 kilometer type of asteroids out there that do cross our path from time to time, you're talking millions of years between them threatening the Earth. When you're talking the 140 or so or 100-meter rocks, you're talking still hundreds and hundreds of years between impacts. But the smaller the size of the asteroid, the more there are, therefore the more collisions. And you're going to have the Chelyabinsk size explosions probably every 10, 20, 30 years. The good news is 70% of them are going to happen over water. The other 30%, many of them will be over remote, desolate areas. But geez, do we really want to take a risk in this hair trigger world of not being prepared to at least see these things and know that nothing man-made is coming at us? At least it's something that we can naturally explain so people don't take the wrong actions.
So I think the question on everyone's minds probably during this is, it sounds like we have some really good ideas for detecting these asteroids, and it sounds like some really good work's going into that. What do we do when we find one that's threatening to us?
That is the question of the day. And you'd have to look at a couple things. What are the technologies that are kind of off the shelf that you could use? Now, the good news is if you find something, say, 3 or 4 orbits before it's going to be a threat to the planet, that gives you time to do certain techniques that might, can be low risk, that you could probably do additively to each other, do it several times. And the easiest one to do is what's called a kinetic impact. And that's essentially flying a robotic spacecraft into the asteroid. And you'd want to try to deflect it. You actually don't want to deflect it side to side. You want to deflect it along the path of its travel, just to slow it down or speed it up by maybe 1 or 2 centimeters per second, because these things are traveling at about 10 to 15 kilometers per second. If you can slow it down even by a couple of centimeters, over time, that cumulatively will make it past the Earth and not hit the Earth, which is a really good thing. So let's say we detect something that's going to hit us in 20 years. there would be time then to launch a number of unmanned robotic spacecraft. You could just slam into this thing. There's no explosive force being brought to it other than the kinetic impact. And it might be enough to do the trick. The real tricky part is if you just discover something that's pretty much on terminal impact. It's maybe with one orbit to go, or it's a comet coming from the Oort cloud and it's now out by Jupiter, and we just discovered it for the first time. You've only got a couple of weeks. The only option available now, and no one wants to hear this, but the only option available is a nuclear blast. And the thing is, there's no country on Earth that has a nuclear missile designed for this sort of activity. But I bet they would scramble real hard to try to figure out how to do that. There are the missile launchers that are available. You've got enough propulsion to get a nuclear warhead out there. There's actually a lot of research going into this as well. Dr. Bung Wee out at Iowa State University has done a lot of research trying to figure out if you were to have to use nukes, could you do this? Would it impact the Earth in any way? Would it cause a radioactive cloud out there that would, hit the Earth? And the answer is it's actually a lot cleaner solution than most people give it credit for. Of course, we don't want to go there unless it's the absolute last resort. There's so many other options that we would hope we'd have time to implement.
In the Bruce Willis film you mentioned, they specifically rule out the nuclear weapon because they make up some silly guff about the asteroid being porous. But I always thought that was kind of silly. Like, obviously, they're basically just huge bombs that have a lot of kinetic force and a lot of thermal force, and that does seem like a very obvious way to deal with something like that. I wonder if we'd run into some issues with the various policies that are currently in place for nuclear weapons in space and that sort of situation.
Oh, it would be an absolute madhouse when it came to actually employing one of these things. That's why I think it's the absolute last resort. I mean, Dr. Ed Lu, who flew on the space shuttle several times, who runs the B612 Foundation, and they're dedicated to helping develop the technologies to mitigate a threat and also to send up a spacecraft called Sentinel, which would be in a Venus-like orbit facing outward from the sun and identify as many of these potentially hazardous objects as possible. He's really been a proponent of what's called the gravity tractor. And this is what's known as a slow push technique or a slow pull technique, where we all know that any object with mass can create gravity. So what you would basically do in theory is just take a spaceship and park it, maybe 100 or 200, 300 yards in front of the asteroid. And over 10 or 15 or 20 years, however long, that would nudge that asteroid to go a little bit faster, a little bit slower along its own, current orbit, which would be a very good thing. That would then prevent it from hitting Earth. And some folks down at Langley, NASA have discovered there's an even better way to do that. It's called the enhanced gravity tractor. What you do is you take a spacecraft that goes to the asteroid and breaks off a chunk of the asteroid or picks up a couple of boulders from one of these rubble pile asteroids and then sits in front of it. And by adding that extra mass, you therefore increase the gravitational attraction. So instead of having to take 20 or 30 years to nudge this asteroid off course, you might be able to do it in 3 or 4 or 5 years. It's a pretty fascinating concept. Yeah. The problem is we don't have the technology right now to park a spacecraft right in front of an asteroid. It's something that we would have to work on. Right. NASA is doing a lot of good work in this regard, as is the private industry. The two firms that are looking to actually eventually mine asteroids, Deep Space Industries and Planetary Resources, are looking at these sorts of things. It's a lot of very brilliant entrepreneurs looking at this sort of stuff. And I think they and NASA together are going to be doing a lot of good work in the years ahead. NASA, their next big mission is going to be called the Asteroid Redirect Mission, where they're going to go out and find an asteroid and then snag it somehow and put it into a near moon orbit. That mission itself will develop a lot of these technologies that will help in future mitigation of any sort of threat. Things like hovering near or circling or orbiting an asteroid. How about this? How hard is it to land on an asteroid? For these people that want to mine an asteroid someday, or if we want to put explosives on the face of an asteroid, well, it's really, really hard to land on an asteroid because they've got almost no gravity to speak of. So you've got to find a way to take that spacecraft and tether it to the surface. We saw with the Rosetta spacecraft that was out with the 67P Churyumov-Gerasimenko comet. They landed a little lander on the comet last year, and the lander kind of fell into a crevasse and was never heard from again. So these are rocky surfaces. They're rough. It's a really hard engineering challenge to design something that can land robotically and kind of plunk itself onto the surface and not float away. So there's a lot of technological development that has to happen to make this a reality.
So, a lot of this discussion is, and often is, especially in the media and in pop culture, is about these huge asteroids that are going to destroy the planet. But these little ones that we're going to see every 5, 10, 15 years or so, the ones that were responsible for the city in Russia and, well, both, there was the city in Russia and then the what's that event that happened in the Russian woods that was a huge asteroid that exploded,
Yeah,
leveled the entire
that was Tunguska in
Tunguska.
Siberia
That's
in
it.
1908, and that was about they think it was a 50 to 70 meter diameter asteroid, so a pretty big rock, and
Are,
it leveled 60 million trees over 2,000 square kilometers. It was a pretty
good
big
lord.
event.
Are there any options for defense against those sorts of impacts? I mean, I'm thinking here that if we identified one somehow and we found out that it was going to explode over New York City, people might be a little bit concerned about that.
I think the first thing that people would look at is the you've got to do a number of things. One is when is it going to happen, and
Mm-hmm.
so once you've determined that, whether it's a year, 5 years, 30 years, 50 or whatever, that's going to guide the choices that you have in front of you. The bottom line, though, right now with current science, and again, this is something that a lot of people don't want to hear. If it were a near-term event, and I'm talking probably within a year or two, probably some sort of nuclear strike is the only way to do it. You could try kinetic impact, depending on the size of the space rock. If
Mm-hmm.
it's a smaller, say a 50 or 70 meter, you could almost certainly deflect it off course using kinetic impact alone. Of course, you'd have to design the spacecraft and you'd have to spend a lot of money very quickly. But look, we built the Pentagon in 18 months. We developed the atomic bomb in 24 months. We sent men to the moon in less than a decade from scratch, essentially. So we can do this as a nation, and the international cooperation we have would be tremendous. So the bottom line is you have to kind of figure out how much time you have first. Then there's some other really important characteristics as well. You have to know what sort of asteroid or comet this is,
Right.
because if it's a solid mass of iron, which some asteroids are, that's a lot different approach you're going to take than if it's what's called a rubble pile, which is basically a big conglomeration of loosely accreted material. Because a kinetic impact will do a lot for a solid asteroid, but won't do a whole lot for something that's loosely held together. In fact, it might fly right through it and not really alter its course too much. So you'd have to kind of figure out what sort of asteroid it is. And you do that through two ways. One is remote characterization, where using our satellites, I'm sorry, our telescopes and the radar telescopes we've got at Arecibo down in Puerto Rico and Goldstone out in California, you can get a lot of information about the composition of that asteroid or comet. Ideally, what you would do is before you tried to mitigate it, you would have time to actually go visit that space body robotically. You would send out a probe. It would go and try to land. It would take all the measurements. It would find out all the characteristics that you really want to know. The size, the composition, the shape, the spin rate, the spin axis, the mass, the structure, all that stuff, because that will help you develop the best mitigation solution that you can employ.
Right. Having that information is always, information being probably the most important thing that we can have against these things.
Right.
It's interesting to me that the defense against the smaller asteroids basically sounds like similar to the defense against the larger asteroids.
Yeah, I mean the essential elements for any size asteroid pretty much come into play. I mean, there is a certain size of asteroid, probably above 5 or 10 kilometers, where there's really nothing that we have on Earth right now that could do anything about it. That would be basically a get ready for Armageddon type of scenario. But again, the chances of that happening, those are once in a billion years type of events.
Sure.
Now they have happened. I mean, if you go down to South Africa, you'll find a crater down there called Vredefort, which is about 300 kilometers across. It's the largest impact crater we know of on the planet, and it happened about 2 billion years ago. They think that was about a 5 to 8 kilometer wide asteroid that hit down there 2 billion years ago. So thankfully, it doesn't happen too often. You also find about 200 other impact craters across the face of the Earth. And remembering that, two-thirds of the Earth's surface is water, we got to extrapolate and say there's at least 600 or 700 impacts that we pretty much can surmise have happened over the last, couple billion years. Some of them happened fairly recently. That Barringer crater out in Arizona is about 50,000 years old, and it left an impact crater, almost a mile wide. So they're out there, and but anything less than a couple of kilometers wide is something that we could address. There is the existing technology; it's just not in place yet. So I think you'd have all sorts of crash programs happen once we identified one of these threats to get some mitigation in place.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. One other question that a guest wanted me to ask. This was the first time I've ever done a writing question. Would it be more efficient to train astronauts to be drillers or drillers to be astronauts? I think I get where that's coming from.
Well, one of the problems is we don't have the technology yet, really, to do that sort of drilling in space. I mean,
Right.
Again, you'd have to spend some time getting the technology to allow you to land and tether yourself and work in a virtually zero gravity environment. And there's a lot of issues. For example, if you're going to go and start removing resources from an asteroid in bulk, and by the way, one of the ways to mitigate a threatening asteroid is to send a robot to that planet that would just basically mine the planet and expel the chunks of rock in one direction to make a counterforce that would slow it down or speed it up. So that's actually one of the options on the table. But whether you're doing that for planetary defense, or you're doing it to mine resources off an asteroid, we just don't have the technologies yet that can work in virtually zero gravity, in the cold and heat of space. Think of things like lubricants that we use here on Earth. Those lubricants are going to probably vaporize when they get into the vacuum of space. So you have to have certain types of tools that can operate. Now, there has been quite a bit of development in this regard, but we're just not there yet. So that's again another piece that perhaps this asteroid redirect mission is going to help with. And there's a lot of companies looking at this right now, trying to figure out. So to answer your question, I really don't know whether it's better to train a miner to be an asteroid or the other way around.
I think that one of the really interesting things, and at least how it ties into the show, is that planetary defense and asteroid mining are basically two fields that go hand in hand. Like you say, a lot of the things that we could do to defend ourselves against asteroids rely upon these new technologies that are being developed for basically mining purposes. So many things like the detection, the being able to tell what an asteroid is made out of, the ability to land a device on it and access the ground of the asteroid directly. Things like that are being developed now for the purposes of asteroid mining, but I can see a lot of those technologies being used just as well to detect and deflect dangerous asteroids coming toward us.
That's exactly the case. And when you look at what people like Planetary Resources and Deep Space Industries are looking at, you have to detect it, you have to track it, you have to characterize it, you have to go up, hopefully, and explore it a little bit in situ, actually get your hands on or a robotic hands on to take a really close look. Then the question is, what do you do with it? So if you're going to deflect it or if you're going to mine it, again, a lot of those same technologies come right into play. And that's why I think that the space mining industry and NASA have a natural synergy and natural partnership where they can both make advances in their respective fields by working together. There's a lot of public-private partnership opportunities where they can develop some sort of these things which have multiple applications once they're developed.
We talked about a little bit, we touched on them in the last couple questions, but what current projects are being worked on to further this field? You mentioned that NASA, the big project by NASA to do some asteroid wrangling, which I think everyone's very excited about. And the Rosetta mission, I imagine, was a fairly big milestone in the field of working with asteroids, whether through detection or through mining. What else is on the horizon?
Yeah, a couple of things. There's a Japanese spacecraft that launched recently. It's the follow-up to a spacecraft back in 2005, landed. It was the first spacecraft to ever land on an asteroid, the asteroid Itokawa. So it's a Japanese spacecraft called Hayabusa 2, and they're going to be landing on another asteroid here within a couple of years and try to take a sample and bring it back to Earth, which is pretty exciting. And then there's a U.S. project, OSIRIS-REx, which is going to go up, and I think in 2020, if I have the date right, is going to land on an asteroid and try to do a similar type of mission. And what's good about that is, again, it helps develop these technologies of actually getting up there and getting on board and doing stuff on the surface of a minor celestial body that has virtually no gravitational pull. It's really interesting. The Hayabusa, the original one, when it sent its little lander down onto the asteroid, it had a lot of problems. They weren't even sure that it actually fully landed. It just, because of the low gravity environment, it was just they found it very, very difficult to maneuver. So what you see in the movies makes a real world, very challenging operation look easy.
Right.
Just running around the surface of a minor planet with almost no gravity is a very tough technological challenge.
I think a lot of people probably don't even realize quite how little gravity these things have. We're not just talking about like moon level gravity. That we're talking about like you run a little too fast and you're flying off the thing.
It's even worse than that. If you went up to a 300-meter wide asteroid right now, it has 1/20,000th of Earth's gravity.
Basically nothing.
Basically nothing. That's right.
Yeah, I think the Japanese lander. What I was reading about that is they, as soon as it landed, it bounced,
Right.
hugely
Right.
just off the surface before it could even deploy the little hooks that it had to dig into the ground.
Yeah, and the other thing that's happening, and it's a very positive development now, if you were to look at the U.S. government and say, why the heck isn't this like the number one top priority? We could go into the politics of this, but clearly something that's not an immediate threat isn't going to get a whole lot of attention. I think we have to give both the Congress and the executive branch a little bit of credit here. Congress has been kind of pushing the executive branch since the 1990s to kind of get on top of this issue. And it was the Congress that required the first Space Guard survey back in 1990. They said, hey, you need to go out and find all these kilometer-wide asteroids, and you've got 25 years to do it. And then in 1998, they reduced that time frame. They said, no, we're a little bit more worried now. We want you to get this all done within 10 years. And then back in 2005, they said, well, 1,000 kilometers, that's important, but we want you to get all the way down to 140 meters wide. We want to find every one of those things as best we can in the next 20 years. And so that's kind of the framework that we're working off now. So NASA's they haven't drugged their feet, but they've never been really well funded for this. I think they've done a marvelous job considering the meager funding that they've gotten. The current administration is the first to actually, in their space policy, to recognize, even to mention, searching for asteroids that might be hazardous to the planet in their national space policy. So that's a positive step. But perhaps the most important thing is that NASA just recently, within the last couple of months, established a Planetary Defense Coordination Office. They used to have just basically one guy who kind of was in charge of the finding of the asteroids. And of course, he had a lot of folks out in the field, out at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and other places doing fantastic work. But they've now made it a more formal office. It's going to have some more resources flowing to it. There's a lot of international work going on in the same realm. So I think some of the chairs are starting to line up on the deck here, and that's a good thing. It's hard to get a lot of political pressure, a lot of energy into this when it's not an immediate threat to anybody, but it's at least moving in a very positive direction right now.
A lot of this seems to be in line with something that I like to refer to as the normalization of space, in that this threat, this large asteroid, so often depicted as this huge once in a billion years event that completely levels the entire planet and is a huge, apocalyptic thing, being slowly recognized as, well, yeah, that could happen, but not very often. The more dangerous things are the things that we've talked about so far, and those also have to be accounted for. And slowly, with these things that you're talking about, are we seeing asteroid and planetary defense turn less from a movie level thing to a everyday disaster preparation sort of approach?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because just in the last couple months that NASA and FEMA have put together the Planetary Impact Emergency Response Working Group. So they're actually working hand in hand. But I got to be honest with you, I hope we never get to the point where we have to respond to an impact. I hope that as a species, we're smart enough to realize that there's a lot of these things out there that are unknown right now, that are zipping by, and we need to find them before they find us. And there's so much benefit. The things that you push pretty much as an advocate, with space settlement, with space resources. I think we've all kind of come to the conclusion that the absolute best way to settle space is to have a space economy that's not based on having to hoist things out of the Earth gravity well, but to exploit the resources that are already out there, whether it's on the moon, on some of the moons of Mars, whether it's on the asteroids, the comets, whatever. There's a lot of stuff in space that we can use for rocket fuel, for building solar panels in space, you name it. It's all out there. It's just getting technology developed to work on those sorts of things. And it goes so well hand in hand with the planetary defense effort that it's almost blindingly obvious that these two things need to be very well partnered together, these two efforts.
Right. Before we go, I had one question I wanted to ask real quick. The weirdest way I've ever heard for asteroid deflection was to paint a part of an asteroid and use some kind of heat from the sun to deflect it. Is that a viable method of asteroid deflection?
It actually is. It's one of the slow push methods. It would take probably 20, 30, 40, 50 years. But what you've got is every asteroid is pretty much rotating. And as the rays of the sun land on the surface, as that asteroid rotates, it of course gives off photons of reflective energy. If you were to paint one half of the asteroid or a large swath of the asteroid a bright white color, or whatever color would absorb the most or reflect the most, you could actually emit more or less photons, and therefore alter the spin rate of the asteroid, which would put a side counterforce that would move it slightly off its orbit. Again, we're talking, millimeters per month or maybe millimeters per year or whatever, just little tiny nudges, but over time they build up. It's called the Yarkovsky effect, is this re-emitting of the radiation. So it is something that is technologically feasible. It's probably not the most practical thing to do. I don't know how you would get the paint to adhere in a zero gravity environment. It could get kind of messy for somebody.
Or even how you'd get the paint to spray, I suppose.
Yes,
a lot of questions there. It's always so fascinating to me, asteroid deflection, because so many of these techniques rely on these slow pushes that happen over such long periods of time, over such huge distances. It really is a very useful tool, I find, to actually explain the various scales you're talking about in space. Like if you try to tell someone, the equivalent is like trying to tell someone that to stop this train hitting someone, you're going to walk up to it and just, you as a person, just push it for a while.
With a feather. That's right.
Right, exactly. And, that doesn't sound like realistic, but then when you explain to someone that this train is going to be traveling millions of miles, and your little push with a feather is going to be imparting just enough that it changes just that little much, and that over those millions of miles, that adds up. It's one of those really good illustrative forces that I find to explain the scale of space to people.
Yeah, well said. Like it.
Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, well said. It's good analogy.
Anyway, James, it's been a fantastic episode. It's really good to finally get this subject touched upon and answer a couple of the questions that our listeners have had. It's a really fascinating piece of, a really fascinating field. One that honestly originally got me interested in asteroids and led to the love of space settlement that I currently have. I was one of those kids who was always, worried about asteroids coming and destroying us all in the night. So it's been really good to talk to you. It's really fantastic to hear some of this information, and I'm really excited about some of these future developments you talked about.
Agree totally, and I think it's something where we're headed in the right direction. We need to keep the public pressure on to not give up on this, and hopefully it won't come about because of another impact or another disaster that where people get hurt or killed.
Fingers crossed. I'd like to have you on another time to maybe we can delve into the policy side of this a little bit more. I get a feeling that's going to be somewhere where there's a lot to talk about.
Sure, absolutely.
All right. Thanks very much.
Yep, take care. Thank you.
Hey folks, thanks for listening. I hope you guys really enjoyed the show. If you did, don't forget to let everyone else know by voting us 5 or giving us a thumbs up or leaving a review or however it is you do that wherever it is you listen to it. If you really like us, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, we're Voices from L5 on there, or on Twitter @Voices from L5. Big thank you to Symphony of Science for letting us use their music, and a huge shout out to Nick Lacrome, our $10 Patreon. Hey, if you guys want to support us, make sure we get amazing guests and fantastic equipment and be able to make the best show we can, go to www.voicesfroml5.com to find out more. Lastly, huge thank you to the NSS for supporting us. We are still a NSS project, and it's been great. Thank you guys. Don't forget to go to www.nss.org to find out how to become a member of the biggest private citizen space settlement group in the world. Thanks.